Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Inner Loop YouTube channel. I'm Lena, the manager of our Author's Corner series, and today I'll be having a conversation with John Kropf about his nonfiction book, Color Capital of the World, Growing Up with the Legacy of a Crayon Company. For more John and more Author's Corner, you can check out our website to find articles, interviews, podcast episodes, and most importantly, a link to purchase the book. Welcome, John. So happy to have you here.
Lena, thank you so much for having me. I've got to say right off the bat, I am a huge fan of Interloop. What Rachel and Courtney have done, and now you, is fantastic. I've been going to the events for years now, and so I'm just thrilled to be part of this effort. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's like so great to talk to you now because I did get to hear you read a little excerpt from this book a while ago at one of our live readings, but hadn't gotten to dive into the entire project. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about the process of writing, and we'll
Yeah.
get into all the research that you've done and everything. So where are you right now?
So
In the world, in your house?
I am at home and I live in North Arlington, and this is what my daughter calls my brain. It's actually a small room that used to be a sun porch, and when we did some remodeling to the house, the deal that I struck was I could convert the sun porch into it's my book sanctuary. So I have a floor to ceiling set of shelves, and this is my happy place with my books and my memorabilia. So this is where I come
Amazing.
to
Oh, I
read.
love it. Must get so much light as well.
Yeah, it worked out well. We get some good light, and it's cozy in here. So I'll
Yeah,
say that.
great. What does your writing practice look like these days?
So I have I'm a journal. I do journaling a lot, and so um, my writing is basically I try to grab those quiet moments of the early morning and get up, and that's when I feel like my thoughts are fresh, the world is fresh. I can sit quietly and just write down different impressions, and sometimes it's nothing more than uh, kind of observations or playing around with words. But um, I having written the book, it opened up a few new opportunities for me, which I had never thought about. The book is set in the Midwest, and I happened to connect with a um, a scholar of Middle West studies who is from the University of South Dakota. His name is John Lauk, and he started a journal about it's called the Middle West Review, and he gave me a couple opportunities to write articles for the journal. So one of them I was really pleased about was I did writing about Rust Belt memoirs. So kind of sampling 5 different memoirs that were set in Rust Belt cities of the Midwest and writing about that. So that's been a fun byproduct of writing the book.
So, for our viewers who might not be familiar already with your work or with your personal history, would you mind summarizing for us kind of quickly your history in the Midwest, your family's history in Sandusky, Ohio, and with the American Crayon Company?
Sure. So, I mean, the book, for those that don't know, it is set in Sandusky, Ohio, which is kind of a mid to small size town. It's on the Great Lakes. It's on Lake Erie, um, and Sandusky was part of the one of the very first areas of um, after the 13 colonies were settled. The next sort of land expansion was called the Northwest Territory, and it was created um, in 1787, and it included everything from starting from Ohio, moving all the way up into everything in north of the Ohio River up to the eastern shore of the Mississippi River. So that really was the foundation of um, sort of building the Midwest. And from there, you had kind of this next wave of, I'll say, I don't know, immigrants that came out of the Northeast to settle in these new states that were developing, and Ohio was one of the very first. And this story focuses on a period of there was tremendous innovation going on in Ohio. It really takes off after the Civil War. You had one of the very first railroads started in Sandusky. In the county where I grew up, Thomas Edison was born. Right downstate, you had the Wright brothers, sort of right around the corner, you had Henry Ford. All of these amazing, innovative steps were being taken in the beginning of our industrial age. And my story fits into that because it was the creation of the very first color crayons, children's color crayons that were practical and affordable. And I can I can kind of go into the three families that made that happen if you want me to. Um,
Yeah, why not? Yeah, give us kind of like a brief family tree, let's say.
sure. So it was basically three families coming together that made this new invention of color children's color crayons possible. You had the first family were called the Cowdreys, and they were the educators. There was a man named Marcellus Cowdery, and he was a very, very innovative educator. He was the first superintendent of Sandusky schools. And education was a big thing in the Northwest Territories. In fact, in the Northwest Ordinance, it says education shall be strongly encouraged. So schools were set up, free public schools were set up in the Northwest Territories. And this is what drew him out from his family had lived in New England. They came out to Ohio. He wanted the most advanced, you know, educational practices to take place in his schools. And at the time, they had this very rough hewn chalk that the teachers were using on the school boards. It was essentially raw hunks of chalk carved out of the cliffs of Dover in England, used in sailing ships as ballast. And when they came over to the United States, that chalk was just repurposed and carved up for different things. And the chalk was so bad and crumbled, but the worst thing about it was it made a terrible sound on the chalkboard. And Marcellus Cowdery, every morning he heard this, and he said he couldn't stand the sound of his teachers and his students having to listen to this awful scratching sound every morning. So he turned to his brother-in-law. Brother-in-law was a man named William Curtis, and this is the second family. William Curtis had served in the Ohio Volunteer Regiment in the Union Army and had been discharged, but he was a farmer by training, and he knew all about the soils around that part of Ohio. And when Marcellus turned to him and said, "Can you solve my chalk problem?" Well, William Curtis knew of this quarries in the area that had very fine deposits of gypsum, and gypsum was like a talc, a very, very fine powder. And he would use the Dover chalk, and he'd mix in some of this gypsum, and he experimented on the family kitchen, mixing up different concoctions. And they began, boiling it up and pouring it into molds, and they'd bake it in the family oven. And eventually they hit on the right formula that is essentially that smooth stick of chalk that everybody, classrooms around the country adopted. And from there, it was successful in selling it to the schools, and they added pigment, and that's where the crayons will come in later. But they needed a third element to this, and this is where the third family comes in. And this was a man by the name of John Whitworth, who was my great grandfather. I'm actually named after him. he was a local banker. He had nothing but an eighth grade education, but he is what you might call a venture capitalist. He put up the money to create the company that really took off, called the American Crayon Company. And so in 1890, they incorporated, they issued stock, and away they went. And so that's the three families coming together in this innovative time.
When did you start writing this book? Take us through the timeline. So, when
Yeah.
did you first start researching, and then how long did the whole process take?
So I would say I started off and on maybe 5 year period, and especially during COVID, I was able to get a lot done, um, and it was pretty expansive in scope. But I think there were two personal things that happened at this time to really motivate me to write it. I had lost my mother and my sister within a year of each other, and I'd gone back to Sandusky, which is where everybody grew up, and went to the family cemetery where they're buried next to all of these other characters in the book that started the crayon company. So and my father had passed away too within this time, so it was a very there's a lot of loss going on. And I'm thinking all these stories are disappearing, and I'm the last person in my immediate family with these stories. And at the same time, I was reading about the factory where all these crayons and colored chalk was made was being demolished. So between these two losses that are going on, it really motivated me to double down on the writing. And I initially wanted it to be much broader in scope, but in I took a really good writing proposal class that helped me kind of focus the idea. And I went through one sort of workshop through the Writers Center, and also finally the publishers at the University of Akron Press also helped me, maintain the focus, and really, they put me through some revisions that were very, very helpful in the end. But um, it was about a 5 year process for me, and the book itself is only, it's 140 pages, but it was work.
Yeah, I think that it would be probably useful for a lot of our viewers, members of the community who are writers themselves, to know whether you did sell this book on proposal or if you had a full manuscript when you submitted it.
So I really did have a full manuscript prepared. That was certainly not the final one, but that that was more to my style. I wanted to be able to have something from beginning to end to put out there. The proposal is was very helpful. It sort of was symbiotic. I mean, one played off the other. Writing the proposal helped me also to distill down parts of the manuscript, because it really teaches you to say what's important and how can you be concise. And the proposal course was definitely a help to me there. Um,
I've actually heard a lot of writers say that the act of describing their own work changes, and kind of in this process of alchemy, like changes the
yeah.
crux of the work itself, or distills it into its kind of its true essence. Yeah, that's wonderful. So I am super excited to talk about the research process as someone who conducts a lot of research in my own writing, and it's just kind of an integral part of the writing process, regardless of genre. Um, so what types of research did you do? It seems like, from the perspective of the reader, that there is scholarly research in here, definitely archival material. There's a lot of characterization of people who are no longer with us, down to their facial hair and the way they carry themselves. Lots of detail. They really come alive and jump off the page. So was this already in your wheelhouse, this depth of research? And what skills did you have to teach yourself?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that it was quite an involved process. I mean, I'm an attorney by training, so I have some preset skills in terms of research and digging for facts, which I did. It helped me some. Number one, I was also, in terms of the sources, I was extremely lucky. My family, I had a grandmother who was really into genealogy, and with the loss of all the family, all of these records on genealogy, all of the records, not all, but the surviving records that I had from the American Crayon Company also passed down to me. So that was kind of the core of my research. But the biggest gaps were really, there were so few people left that had, in my family, there, that was the hard part. Is I, there were not a lot of people in my immediate family to talk to. I did some digging. I actually reconnected with a third cousin who was part of the Curtis line, and she was very helpful. And it turned out she had her own treasure trove, and I actually connected with her. We had lunch, and I got to go through some of her artifacts. I also found that my local library, hometown library in Sandusky, was invaluable. There was an archivist and a historian there, uh, Ron Davis. I thank him in the book, who was just invaluable in terms of, I needed to run facts down, and he could very quickly confirm things. And then I'll say, the last bit is maybe a bit unconventional, but it's part of our time. Is I would go. There were social media groups that were dedicated to my hometown of Sandusky and the history of Sandusky, and I would periodically just put out a call for, say, anybody in this group remember the American Crayon Company? Did anybody work there? And I did get a couple of good leads there. So I was able to follow up with those folks, do some phone interviews, and that provided. I mean, I really like that human element, that those tidbits, and then finally just digging around. The Sandusky Library had some great online resources, and I went into some newspaper archives as well. So hope that hope
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
answers
That's
the
so
question.
wonderful. Archivists are just the best people, aren't
Oh
they?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, they're the best. I mean, I learned so much, and they've got so much information if you just take the time to talk.
Like human encyclopedias, it's marvelous. And they're so willing to go down a rabbit hole with you. That's wonderful. So I am curious, in nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, especially, that's about a real place involving real people, but even if those people are no longer with us, the place, obviously, I mean, it's continuing to change and thrive. I'm curious, in the 5 years that you were working on this book, um, did anything change in the world, in Sandusky, in Ohio, in your life, that changed the writing process, or that called for a different approach in certain ways, or facts that maybe didn't exist when you started the writing process that then you had to introduce? Anything like that? Any changes in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I hope this is answering your question. I mean, part of the motivation in writing this is I'm sitting here in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm going online reading stories from the hometown paper about the factory is now scheduled for demolition. And it was sort of like, it kind of languished for a time. There were a lot of legal squabbles as to who was going to take on the liability for demolishing the factory and so on. And as that was going on, I was going back to Ohio. As I mentioned, my mother and sister passed away. And so when I would go back to Ohio, I would go around this vacant factory and try to just get pictures. And um, some people would actually go in behind the fence and crawl through the factory to take souvenirs or whatever they could before they knocked it down. So there was this kind of race against time feeling of, I gotta get a few more pictures before this is gone, because I read a lot of background books on the Rust Belt as I was writing this, and there was one that was really very influential. It was about Youngstown, and it was by an academic press. And Youngstown was one of the steel centers of the United States, and there was this giant, um, furnace called the the Jenny, and the Jenny was there was a lot of controversy as to whether to take the Jenny down as the steel plants are uh, shuttering their doors. And what the writers said stayed with me. They said that we get our meaning from memory, and our memory is embedded into the landscape of these different places. So in Youngstown, it was the Jenny. The Jenny was gave Youngstown residents meaning. The crayon company, even though it was just a building, gave meaning and memory to the residents of Sandusky. So there was this fight against something disappearing, and that motivated me to want to capture as many stories as I could. Um, so that was probably the biggest change going on. Um,
Yeah,
Sandusky's still going through a transition. I mean, they are leaving this industrial past behind. It's really trying to position itself in different ways, being on the water and having, you know, they have that waterfront as their asset.
absolutely. I love that you were reading books dealing with similar, dynamics and obviously the kind of pressure of time, and of industry and the changing economy, global economy. And I thought you did such a wonderful job at illustrating these sort of transnational forces intersecting in this one particular place. And I'm curious, you mentioned earlier that one of the challenges maybe that you faced was limiting your scope. I mean, you could have written about what seems to me to be an endless vocabulary of places that touched the lives of Sanduskians in some way. So, how did you determine your scope in the end?
Well, my scope was much wider, and initially I did chapters on. There was a I've talked about the innovation, the spirit of innovation that was happening at this time, and there were so many other things happening in this part of just Sandusky alone in Erie County where it's set. Um, there were some of the very first electric uh, commuter trains. They called them interurbans. That I think the second one in the United States was basically anchored in Sandusky, and it would go along the North Shore of Ohio. There were other innovations. There were probably over 100 automobile startups in Ohio alone at the turn of the century. There were, innovations with uh, the aircraft industry that were actually there was a startup for airplanes in Sandusky. I wanted to go into the railroad story, but the editor said no. Let's just focus on the crayons because you're getting too far afield, and they were right. But there was just so much happening that I could have. I have a lot of material left over. Put it that way.
It's, I mean, the dilemma I feel of any nonfiction writer, right? Is like, how much information do you give that it's not irrelevant? But I thought you did a really wonderful job of summarizing the role of the railroad and, all the way through to NAFTA and outsourcing, in the end, at the sort of the end of, I guess, the physical factories story in the book. So I want to talk a little bit about the characters. So we've sort of touched on the research process, and the other places that were linked to Sandusky, but we haven't talked a whole lot about the people in your immediate life, not just your ancestors, but the people you grew up with. I feel like a lot of my students ask this question, which is, how do you write about people you know? How do you turn them into characters that feel true to you, that serve the quote unquote argument of the book, and that, you know, honor their legacy, whatever you might believe that should be, because, the nonfiction writer is kind of in control. So I was particularly touched by the characterization of the narrator's mother in this book. I thought there was such a wonderful balance of empathy and critique. And just like to quickly summarize for viewers who haven't read the book, that there's this sort of fortune that is implied, or if not fortune, then at least assets that might have been inherited, that sort of get spent or dissipate through the years. And the narrator is sort of grappling with that absence of inheritance, and their relationship with their mother, which is kind of complicated. So, how did you approach writing that? Was it personally difficult or challenging? Thanks.
It's a great question, and that probably was the character. My mother in the book may have been the hardest one to write about. I mean, she had passed away not that long ago, and she's a pivotal character in the story because she really is my last link um, to all of these families in the crayon company. And I my mother is really the inspiration for the book. My mother and my grandmother, because I would just say to your students, um, so many of the seeds for this book were planted in my head when I was 5 years old, and I heard all the stories that my mother would tell about the crayon company and the crayons. And kids absorb a lot of stuff, and it stayed with me and stayed with me. But when it came time to write it, I wanted to I wanted to honor my mother, but also be there's a certain honesty that you're trying to engage in. And there's there's a sort of a tragedy in the book, in that unfortunately at the time my mother came along in the 50s and coming into adulthood, women were not trained to be brought into the workforce. They were not brought into the business world. And this to me was a tragedy in many ways, because she, you know one of the reasons that the factory kind of I think ended its life was they didn't they didn't bring in the next generation, which would have been my mother's generation. There were no men born in these different lines that I talked about, with the Whitworth or the Curtis or Cowdery line. And so there is this kind of push and pull going on. I didn't have the luxury of being able to share the book with people I'm writing about, because nobody was left alive. And um, I often take a lot of inspiration from Mary Carr. Wrote a great book about writing memoir and sharing your writings with the people that you're writing about if they're still alive. But I wasn't able to do that here.
Yeah, I find that when you know that the person you're writing about is going to pick up the book, the essay, the journal, and potentially read it, it does pressurize the situation in a way, that I think incites a different level of empathy in a way, in me at least, where um, I don't know if it's empathy in the end. Maybe it's just sort of a sense of surveillance, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, so I can imagine it's complicated knowing that you are sort of freed from the stories that they might have told themselves about what happened. And yet there's this sort of desire to have it be a collaboration, right? It's almost, kind of becomes a more selfish endeavor.
Yeah, that was it was probably the hardest part to to write.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious about ending a book like this. So you really do start from the very beginning. And, we learn about, as you mentioned earlier, the origins of even the idea of a crayon, right? Having an implement to write with that is sort of in the shape, and then pigments introduced, and then oil is introduced, that sort of waxy feeling. And so we move all the way through time up until essentially what is the present day. Um, and then we get an epilogue at the end of the book in which the narrator sort of reflects on the experience of writing the book, what they learned. Um, and it ends up sort of being this wonderful push and pull between kind of like optimism and fatalism a little bit, and um, ultimately reckoning with permanence and impermanence. So, did you always plan to write an epilogue? Did you always plan to write this particular one? How did you arrive at these sort of life lessons?
Those are, it's a great question, and I suppose I just had the idea of there will be an epilogue, but it was all blank pages. I didn't know what it would turn out to be, and the epilogue kind of just, after having gone through this whole experience of writing the book, it's basically all that I learned from it, and all this kind of pent up feeling and experience, and it just kind of came rushing out there at the end, and trying to step back and survey the whole story. That this is one episode of thousands of, you've had this arc of boom, build, and bust in many lives and companies, and this is no different than any other. But I was trying to give it perspective to a larger group of people.
Definitely. Yeah, it's so powerful having that personal connection, and that tenuous connection now, and the narrator sort of looking forward, wondering what relationship their daughter will have to these stories. And I think it's such a powerful note to end on, to have this physical object that
Yeah.
kind of distills all of those stories into one.
Yeah, she gave me, my daughter gave me a book once for, I think, Christmas. It was one of these sort of template books where you tell me your family story and you're supposed to fill out answers to prompts. And basically, when I finished this book, I turned to my daughter Charlotte and I said, "This is your book. So you will have the stories in here."
I love that. Yeah, such a powerful endeavor. Um, so we ask all of our Authors Corner authors to tell us a little bit about their publication process and the journey to publishing the book once they were in touch with, the folks at, in this case, University of Akron Press, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So what was it like working with the press and your journey to publication?
So I can't say enough great things about the University of Akron Press. Just to back up a little bit, I've attempted a couple other books. One successfully, it was a travel book, um, but there was a lot of trial and error involved, and um, I probably went through over 100 rejections with that book, and then there was an earlier book that didn't make it. But what the experience of sending out proposals told me is that, from those first two books, is I really was much more targeted in selecting what publishers might be interested in it. And so, this was very much a story set in the Midwest, and in particular Ohio. So I really focused on either small presses or academic presses that were set in that region. And I learned a lot from those earlier rejections, to be very focused here. And then once uh, I was accepted. I mean, that's just such a wonderful feeling. Um, Akron had a wonderful process where they had a board of editors that then started to make some suggestions on, you know, focus and style, about what you want to add a little bit more about, say, the history of crayons, or take out all the innovation pieces, but the crayons. That was very helpful. And so now where I am is, I've had this wonderful team. One person collected all the pictures that went into the book. In fact, she did the cover, and the cover to me is, somebody ought to win an award for that. I'll tell you, those crayons are pictures from my collection. I collect crayons, and then they're overlaid on top of a black and white aerial photo of the factory. If you look really carefully, that factory photo is in the book. It's an aerial view from the 50s, but it's if you can see, there you go. Um, it's down below where my name is, and actually where the color capital title is on the cover. I mean, fantastically creative people. And then I've had another word to say about the marketing promotions person. Um, Julia Gammon is her name, and she has helped me find all kinds of little specialty venues and places to try out. And she's been just amazing to work with. So it's a very personalized experience. I don't have anything else to compare it to. Not one other book I published was an independent publisher that went out of business. They went bankrupt. And I don't have the experience of the big, one of the big presses. So
That's so wonderful. Yeah, it's so great to have that kind of personal connection with the person who's championing your work. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, John. It's been such a joy to speak with you about this book. Yeah, I'm so grateful to have learned more of your story and more about Sandusky. And I'll never look at a crayon the same way again.
well, Lena, thank you for, this was a fun interview. I look forward to attending some more Interloop events and hearing, everybody else's stories. Um, and appreciate the chance to talk about color capital of the world.
Thanks for joining us in the Author's Corner. For more conversations with DC area authors and to stay updated about the latest from small independent presses, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook at The Inner Loop DC and on Twitter and Instagram at The Inner Loop Lit.